I took everything to the lawyer and watched her expression change for the first time. Not excitement. Focus. She arranged the documents carefully, stacking them in a way that made sense to her, not to me. She asked no questions for a long while. When she finally looked up, she told me not to respond to my husband yet. Not emotionally. Not legally. Let him think you're confused, she said. Let him think you're scared. That part came easily. I had been playing that role for years. In the days that followed, my husband became more confident. He sent messages reminding me of deadlines. He warned me not to delay things. He said dragging it out would only make it worse for me. I replied politely, asking for time, apologizing for being slow. Each message made him bolder. Then the court date arrived. The first one. I walked into the room alone, wearing nothing that drew attention. He arrived with his lawyer and the woman who had replaced me. She didn't sit close to him, but she made sure I saw her. She smiled like someone who had already won. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't hold back. He told the judge I hadn't worked in years. He said I depended on him completely. He said I contributed nothing to his success. His lawyer called me financially illiterate. They spoke as if I weren't sitting there. I kept my head down. I said very little. When the judge asked if I agreed with his version of events, my lawyer stood and said we would submit documents at the next hearing. The judge nodded and moved on. Outside the courtroom, my husband leaned close and whispered that I should accept the settlement while I still could. He said the court would see through me eventually. He said I had nothing. That night, my lawyer called me and said we were ready. What she planned to submit next would make sure the court never looked at me the same way again. The days before the next hearing felt strangely calm. Too calm. My husband stopped messaging as frequently, as if he believed the outcome was already decided. When he did write, his tone was almost kind, the way people become when they think they're being generous to someone beneath them. He suggested we end things peacefully. He reminded me that court could be embarrassing for someone like me. I thanked him for his concern and said nothing else. Meanwhile, my lawyer worked quietly. She didn't share details with me right away. She asked questions instead. Precise ones. When did the company officially register? Who handled payroll? Who signed off on supplier contracts during the early years? I answered honestly, sometimes surprised by my own memory. I hadn't realized how much I knew until someone finally asked. She requested records from banks, registries, and offices I had never stepped into myself. Each request took time. Each response added weight. She told me to be patient. She told me the law liked patience. My husband, on the other hand, hated it. He wanted quick victories. That would cost him. The second court date arrived, and the room felt different. He was still confident, but there was a flicker of irritation now. His lawyer spoke first again, repeating the same story. A dependent wife. A self-made man. A clean break. Then my lawyer stood and handed over a thick file to the judge. Not dramatic. Not rushed. Just placed it on the desk and stepped back. The judge began reading. The silence stretched longer than before. Pages turned slowly. My husband shifted in his seat. His lawyer leaned in, trying to see what was written. The woman beside him crossed her arms, her smile fading slightly. No one spoke. No one laughed. The judge finally looked up and asked a question that seemed harmless on the surface. He asked whose name the primary property was registered under. My husband answered immediately, confidently, without hesitation. The judge nodded and asked the clerk to read the record aloud. When my name was spoken, clearly and unmistakably, the room changed. My husband turned toward me sharply, as if expecting me to explain myself. I didn't meet his eyes. His lawyer objected quickly, calling it a technicality, saying it didn't reflect real ownership. The judge raised a hand and asked for the next document. There were more. Several more. Each one placed carefully, each one saying the same thing in different ways. My name. My signature. My authority. The judge didn't make a decision that day. He didn't need to. He scheduled another hearing and ordered a temporary hold on certain assets until everything was clarified. Outside the courtroom, my husband didn't speak to me. He argued with his lawyer instead, his voice sharp and low. The woman who had come with him stepped back, suddenly unsure where she belonged. As I walked past them, I felt his eyes on me for the first time in years. Not with dismissal, with fear. That evening, I received a message from an unknown number. It was short. Just one sentence: "We need to talk." This isn't what I thought it was. I didn't reply to the message right away. I read it once, then again, letting the words sit without reacting. For years, I had been the one asking for conversations, explanations, honesty. Now he was the one reaching out, and I understood how powerful silence could be when used correctly. I put the phone down and went back to my evening as if nothing had happened. The next morning, another message arrived. Longer this time. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said lawyers liked to complicate things. He said paperwork didn't always reflect reality. He asked if we could meet privately, without lawyers, just to clear the air. I could almost hear the careful tone behind the words. Not anger. Not affection. Calculation. I showed the messages to my lawyer. She read them, nodded once, and told me not to respond yet. She said desperation made people careless. She said we were still early in the process, even if he didn't realize it. Then she asked me something that caught me off guard. She asked if I had ever signed anything without fully reading it after the company began making serious money. I thought carefully before answering. There were a few moments. A few rushed days. I told her everything. That afternoon, my husband showed up at the house unannounced. He stood at the door like a guest, not an owner. When I opened it, he tried to smile. He commented on how calm I looked. He said he had been worried about me. I stepped aside and let him in, saying very little. He walked through the room slowly, as if seeing them for the first time. He asked if I was managing okay financially. I told him I was fine. He sat across from me and began talking about compromise. He said court would be exhausting. He said we could still be respectful. He said he didn't want things to turn ugly. Then he paused and asked me directly if I had known about the documents all along. I looked at him and said the truth, but not the whole truth. I said I had trusted him with everything. That answer unsettled him more than any accusation could have. Before leaving, he warned me gently. He said his lawyer was confident. He said the judge would see things differently once everything was reviewed. He said I should prepare myself for disappointment. After he left, I locked the door and felt a strange sense of relief. The house felt quieter without his presence. Lighter. 2 days later, the court issued another notice. A request for deeper financial disclosure. More accounts. Older records. Corporate filings. My lawyer smiled when she read it. She said this was the part where stories fell apart. That evening, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. This time, it wasn't him. It was the woman. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. Her voice was tight, controlled, and careful. She asked if we could talk, just for a few minutes. She said there were things I deserved to know. I told her I was listening. What she said next made it clear that my husband wasn't the only one who had been lying, and that changed the game completely. I stayed silent while she spoke, letting her words come out in their own time. She didn't rush. Neither did I. She said she hadn't planned to call me, that she had tried to stay out of everything, but the court notice had changed things. She said my husband hadn't told her the whole truth. Not about the marriage. Not about the money. Not about me. She admitted she believed I had already agreed to leave quietly. He had told her I was weak, dependent, and willing to accept whatever he offered just to avoid embarrassment. He had promised her stability, a future that was already secured. Now lawyers were asking questions, accounts were being frozen, and he had suddenly become unpredictable. That scared her. I asked her one question. Just one. I asked if she knew whose name the company was in. There was a pause on the line. A long one. She said she had assumed it was his. He had never said otherwise. I told her that assumptions were dangerous. Then I ended the call. That night, my husband sent another message. This one was angry. He accused me of turning people against him. He said I was playing dirty. He said I was trying to ruin his reputation. I didn't reply. I forwarded it to my lawyer instead. She told me to save everything. Screenshots, messages, call logs. She said patterns mattered more than emotions. At the next hearing, the judge requested a detailed breakdown of the company's structure. My husband's lawyer tried to delay, claiming records were complex. The judge allowed limited time but made it clear there would be no extensions after that. I watched my husband's confidence crack slightly as he nodded in agreement. For the first time, he looked unsure of what came next. Outside the courtroom, his lawyer pulled him aside and spoke sharply. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the tone. It wasn't reassurance. It was damage control. The woman wasn't there this time. He noticed her absence too. I could tell by the way he kept looking around, as if expecting someone to appear and steady him. Later that evening, my lawyer showed me something she had been waiting to confirm. An internal document from the company's early days. It listed founders, roles, and decision-making authority. My name wasn't just there. It was highlighted by responsibility, finance oversight, contract approval, strategic decisions. Things he had always claimed were his alone. She told me this would matter more than any argument. It showed intent. It showed structure. It showed that my role hadn't been symbolic. It had been essential. I felt a mix of anger and clarity. Anger at how easily I had been erased. Clarity about how thoroughly he had underestimated me. That night, another message arrived from him. Short. Direct. No greeting. Please tell me exactly what you're trying to do. I looked at the screen for a long time before locking my phone and setting it aside. I already knew what I was doing. What he didn't know yet was that the next disclosure wouldn't come from me at all. It would come from inside his own company. The disclosure came sooner than I expected. Not because we rushed it, but because someone else lost patience before we did. My lawyer called me early in the morning and asked if I was sitting down. She told me that one of the company's senior managers had contacted her office directly. Not anonymously. Not quietly. Officially. He said he had been asked to prepare records that didn't match the truth. He said my husband wanted timelines adjusted, roles simplified, and certain approvals attributed to him alone. The manager refused. Not out of loyalty to me, but out of fear for himself. He didn't want to be dragged down when things collapsed. He wanted protection. In exchange, he was willing to cooperate fully. By the time the next hearing arrived, the courtroom felt heavier than before. My husband arrived late. He looked tired, not polished. His lawyer spoke in a controlled tone, but I could hear the strain beneath it. When the judge asked whether the requested disclosures were complete, there was hesitation. Just a second too long. That was when my lawyer stood and informed the court that additional records had been submitted voluntarily by a senior employee of the company. She didn't name him yet. She didn't need to. The judge asked for the file. The clerk brought it forward. I watched my husband's face change as he recognized the formatting. Internal documents. Ones he knew well. The judge asked him if he disputed the authenticity. He tried to speak, then stopped. His lawyer stepped in, asking for time to review. The judge granted a short recess. During that break, my husband didn't look at me. He paced. He argued in whispers. His hands shook when he reached for his phone. When proceedings resumed, the judge asked him a direct question. Had he ever represented himself as sole decision-maker of the company in situations where he was not? The room was silent. The answer mattered more than anything else said so far. He said no. His voice wasn't steady. The judge nodded and asked the clerk to read a portion of the submission aloud. It listed decisions, dates, and approvals. All signed by me. All during periods when he had been absent, traveling, or unavailable. The judge didn't comment. He simply ordered a forensic review of the company's finances and governance. Independent. Immediate. That order changed everything. Outside the courtroom, his lawyer told him the review could take months. That it would be thorough. That nothing could be hidden once it began. I walked past them as they spoke, my steps calm, my expression neutral. He watched me go like someone watching a door close behind them. That evening, the woman finally responded to my earlier silence. Her message was short and unguarded. She said he hadn't come home in 2 days. She said he was angry, blaming everyone. She said she was starting to understand who he really was. I didn't reply. Later that night, my lawyer forwarded me a notice. The company's board had scheduled an emergency meeting. My name was listed first on the agenda. I realized then that court was only one battlefield, and he was losing ground on all of them at once. The board meeting was scheduled for early morning, the kind of time chosen to catch people off guard. My lawyer asked if I wanted to attend in person. I said yes. Not because I needed to speak, but because I wanted to watch. I wanted to see how power shifted when stories stopped working. When I arrived, the room was already full. Faces I recognized from years of dinners and celebrations avoided my eyes. Others looked relieved, as if my presence explained things they had never been able to say out loud. My husband arrived last. He looked surprised to see me there, then annoyed, then suddenly cautious. He took his seat without greeting anyone. The chairperson began by outlining the reason for the meeting. Compliance concerns, governance review, risk exposure. Neutral words that carried sharp consequences. My husband interrupted, insisting the matter was private and already being handled in court. The chairperson reminded him that courts didn't protect companies from internal failures. Silence followed, then the documents were distributed. Copies of what the manager had submitted. Timelines. Approvals. Emails. My name appeared again and again, not as a courtesy, but as a requirement. The board members read quietly. No one defended him. No one rushed to reassure. That was when I understood how fragile loyalty really was. My husband finally spoke, claiming the structure had been symbolic, that I had signed things as a formality while he handled real decisions. One board member asked him to explain a specific contract approved during a period when he was overseas. He tried. He failed. Another asked about a financial decision that had saved the company during a cash shortage years ago. He didn't remember it. I did. They didn't ask me to speak. They didn't need to. The record spoke clearly enough. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to temporarily limit his authority pending the forensic review. He was informed calmly, professionally, without accusation. Just procedure. Just risk management. He stared at the table as if it had betrayed him. Outside the building, he finally confronted me. He demanded to know how long I had been planning this. He accused me of manipulation, of setting traps, of destroying him out of spite. I listened, then told him the truth again, in pieces. I said I had trusted him. I said I had worked quietly. I said I had done exactly what he asked for years. He laughed, bitter and sharp, and said none of that mattered. Then his phone rang. I watched his expression change as he listened. His anger drained, replaced by disbelief. When he hung up, he looked at me like someone seeing the ground disappear beneath their feet. He told me the bank had frozen several accounts connected to the company. Temporarily, they said. Pending review. I nodded, as if this were expected. Because it was. That evening, my lawyer called to tell me the judge had approved the forensic team. Full access. No exceptions. She said this was the point where people usually tried to settle. She asked if I wanted to discuss terms. I told her not yet, because the next thing my husband would lose wasn't money. It was his story. Once his story began to crack, everything around him started making noise. People he had ignored for years suddenly had questions. People who once nodded at his words now asked for proof. The forensic team moved quietly but efficiently, requesting records from departments he barely remembered approving. Every request forced him to explain decisions he had never actually made. He tried to regain control the only way he knew how. He called meetings that no one rushed to attend. He sent emails marked urgent that received polite, delayed replies. When he spoke, people listened carefully now, not to follow, but to document. Authority without trust is a fragile thing, and he was learning that too late. At the next court hearing, his lawyer changed strategy. The tone softened. They spoke about misunderstandings, shared contributions, emotional labor. They suggested mediation. They said prolonged litigation would hurt everyone involved. The judge listened but didn't commit. Then he asked for an update on the forensic review. The lead examiner explained that inconsistencies had already been identified. Not criminal conclusions yet, just unanswered questions. Missing explanations. Overlapping approvals. Patterns that didn't align with my husband's public claims. The judge ordered the review to continue without interference. My husband stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. Outside the courtroom, he followed me for the first time. He asked me to stop this. Not angrily, quietly. He said we were destroying years of work. He said people were watching. He said we could still end things respectfully if I agreed to cooperate. I asked him what cooperation meant. He hesitated, then said I should clarify things publicly. Support his version. Help him move forward. That was when I understood he still believed the problem was visibility, not truth. That night, I received an email from the forensic team. It was brief. They had traced a series of decisions that transferred risk without approval. All signed in my name, but executed differently. They wanted to meet. My lawyer joined the call. We listened as they explained how certain actions had been taken in ways that contradicted documented intent. They weren't accusing me. They were asking if I had authorized those changes. I hadn't. The implication hung in the air. Someone had acted on my authority without my consent. Someone had benefited from that confusion. The forensic lead said this would require deeper examination, possibly testimony. When the call ended, my lawyer didn't speak right away. Then she told me this was bigger than divorce now. She said this could redefine responsibility. She asked if I was ready for that. I thought of all the years I had been invisible. All the times my work had been reduced to nothing. I told her yes. The next morning, my husband sent one last message before everything changed. If you testify, there's no going back. He was right, because once the truth was spoken under oath, it wouldn't belong to either of us anymore. It would belong to the record. I didn't respond to his message. I had learned that my silence spoke louder than any explanation I could offer. Instead, I met with my lawyer and the forensic team the following afternoon. The room was small and windowless, chosen for privacy, not comfort. They didn't waste time. They laid out timelines, transactions, approvals, and actions that carried my name but not my intent. They asked me to walk them through how decisions were normally made when the company was still growing. I explained everything slowly. How I reviewed contracts. How I signed only after reading. How I documented changes. How I kept copies. Their questions became more specific. Did I ever approve emergency transfers without written confirmation? No. Did I allow third parties to act on my authority without oversight? Never. Did I sign blank documents? Absolutely not. The lead examiner exchanged a look with his colleague. Then he told me they had evidence suggesting someone had used my authorization to push through decisions during periods when I was unavailable, decisions that shifted financial risk away from the company and onto entities my husband controlled privately. He didn't say the word fraud. He didn't have to. My lawyer asked if this information would be included in the report. The examiner said yes, with supporting documentation. He said the court would likely request testimony. He said my clarity helped establish intent. I understood what that meant. This was no longer just about who owned what. It was about who was responsible for what went wrong. That evening, my husband showed up again, this time unannounced and uninvited. His composure was gone. He asked if I had spoken to the forensic team. I told him the truth. He asked what I had said. I told him the truth again. That made him angry in a way I had never seen before. Not loud. Sharp. Desperate. He accused me of trying to destroy him. He said I knew how the system worked. He said I could fix this if I wanted to. I asked him how. He said I could say I had approved everything. That I had trusted him to act on my behalf. That it would all be easier that way. I looked at him and realized this was the first time he had ever asked me to choose myself. He just didn't expect the choice I was about to make. The next day, the court issued another notice. My testimony was scheduled. Official. Mandatory. My lawyer said the judge wanted clarity before any settlement discussions continued. The date was close. Too close for him to regain control of the narrative. That night, the woman messaged me again. She said he hadn't told her about the forensic review. She said he was asking her to move money for him. She said she was scared. I told her to speak to a lawyer and say nothing else. When I set my phone down, I felt calm. Not relieved. Focused, because the next time I spoke, it wouldn't be to him. It would be under oath, and he would be sitting right there when I did. The courtroom was quieter on the day of my testimony. No side conversations. No nervous laughter. Everyone seemed aware that this hearing mattered more than the ones before it. My husband sat stiffly beside his lawyer, his eyes fixed forward, as if looking at me might weaken whatever control he still believed he had. When my name was called, I stood and took my place without rushing. The oath felt heavier than I expected. Not because I feared lying, but because I understood the weight of telling the truth in a room built to record it forever. The judge asked me to begin by explaining my role in the company from the beginning. I spoke plainly. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't dramatize. I described what I did, when I did it, and why. I explained how decisions were reviewed, how approvals were given, and how authority was supposed to function. I explained that while my husband was the public face, I was responsible for the structure behind it. The courtroom listened, then came the documents. One by one, they were shown to me. I confirmed which ones I had signed and under what conditions. I explained which approvals required consultation and which did not. I clarified what I had never authorized. Each answer narrowed the space where excuses could hide. When his lawyer cross-examined me, the questions were careful at first. They asked if I trusted my husband. I said yes. They asked if I believed he acted in the company's best interest. I said I believed he should have. They tried to suggest that I had been careless, that I had given broad authority out of convenience. I explained that trust did not mean absence of rules. At one point, his lawyer asked why I hadn't objected sooner if things were so clear to me now. I paused before answering. I said I had no reason to object until the truth was challenged publicly, until I was called useless, until my contributions were denied. That answer stayed in the air longer than any document. The judge asked a few questions himself. Focused ones. About timing. About intent. About benefit. I answered each calmly. When I finished, the room felt different again. Not tense. Resolved. As if something had settled into place. My husband didn't look at me when it was over. He didn't speak. His lawyer requested a brief adjournment. The judge granted it and reminded both parties that testimony carried consequences beyond divorce proceedings. Outside the courtroom, my lawyer told me I had done exactly what was needed. She said the record was clear now. She said the court would take time to consider next steps. As we walked away, a court officer approached us quietly. He said there would be additional inquiries. Regulatory ones. That evening, my phone buzzed with a notification I hadn't expected. The company had issued an internal statement. It acknowledged ongoing reviews and confirmed temporary leadership changes. My husband's name wasn't mentioned. For the first time, his absence was official, and I knew the next hearing wouldn't be about what we owned. It would be about what he had done. The shift was subtle at first, almost polite. People stopped calling him for approvals. Emails stopped including his name by default. Decisions that once passed through him now moved around him, quietly and efficiently. Officially, nothing had been announced beyond temporary adjustments. Unofficially, everyone understood what that meant. The regulatory inquiries began the following week. Letters arrived at addresses he thought were invisible. Requests for explanations he couldn't summarize in confident speeches. They wanted timelines, justifications, consistency. They wanted answers that matched records. For the first time, charm was useless. He tried to reach me again. Not through messages this time, but through intermediaries. A mutual friend asked if I would consider speaking to him privately. A former colleague suggested reconciliation might look better. Even a distant relative hinted that public scrutiny could damage everyone. I declined every request without explanation. I had learned that explanations invited negotiations, and I was done negotiating. The woman stopped messaging me altogether. Later, I heard she had moved out of the apartment he had arranged for her. Quietly. No farewell posts. No public drama. She vanished from his carefully managed life the same way I once had. The difference was that I didn't disappear without leaving a record. The next court update, the judge addressed the new developments directly. He acknowledged the ongoing reviews and reminded my husband that obstruction or misrepresentation would carry serious consequences. My husband's lawyer asked for time. Again. The judge allowed it, but his patience was clearly thinning. Outside, my husband finally looked at me. Not with anger this time, with calculation. He asked if there was still a way to resolve things privately. He said the stress was unnecessary. He said mistakes had been made on all sides. I asked him a simple question. I asked him if he could name one mistake he had made without blaming someone else. He couldn't. That answer told me everything. Later that day, my lawyer received confirmation that the forensic report was nearly complete. She said it would be detailed, clear, difficult to dispute. She warned me that once it was submitted, the case would move faster. Outcomes would follow. She asked if I was prepared for that. I thought about the years I had stayed silent, about the way my life had been reduced to footnotes while others took credit. I told her I was ready. That night, a news alert appeared on my phone. Just a small item. A company executive under review. No name mentioned. But I recognized the phrasing. So did he. He called me immediately. This time, I answered. He didn't threaten. He didn't argue. He asked me what I wanted. I told him the truth, finally and completely. I wanted the truth on record, and once it was there, I wanted out. He went silent, because for the first time, he understood that I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to finish. The forensic report was submitted on a quiet afternoon, without ceremony. No press. No announcements. Just a thick document entered into the record. My lawyer told me that was intentional. When facts are strong, they don't need noise. They speak when someone tries to deny them. The court scheduled an expedited hearing to address the findings. My husband arrived early this time. He looked thinner, older, like someone who hadn't slept enough to hide the fear anymore. His lawyer carried a different posture now. Less confidence. More caution. The judge opened the session by summarizing the report in plain language. Misrepresentation of authority. Unauthorized risk transfers. Personal benefit tied to corporate decisions. Each phrase landed quietly, but none of them were small. When the judge asked my husband if he disputed the findings, his lawyer requested permission to respond on his behalf. The response was careful. They acknowledged errors. They spoke about pressure, rapid growth, poor oversight. They avoided intent. They avoided names. The judge listened, then asked a single question that cut through everything. Who benefited? The answer was already in the report. The judge ordered temporary removal from all executive functions pending further action. He also ordered that certain assets remain frozen until responsibility was determined. This was no longer a divorce matter. It was a governance issue. A legal one. My husband didn't react immediately. It took a moment for the words to reach him. Outside the courtroom, cameras waited for the first time. Not many. Just enough. His lawyer shielded him as they passed, but the damage was already done. Silence can be louder than headlines, and this silence was heavy. That evening, my lawyer called to tell me something else. The board had voted again. This time, it was unanimous. His position was officially terminated. No suspension. No leave. Terminated for cause. She didn't sound pleased or angry when she told me. She sounded resolved. I sat alone in the house and let that settle. The house he once claimed defined him. The house he had tried to take from me. It was quiet. Peaceful. I realized I wasn't celebrating. I was closing a chapter. Late that night, there was a knock at the door. I knew who it was before I opened it. He stood there without his usual certainty, without his rehearsed lines. He asked if he could come in. I said no. He nodded, as if he expected that. He told me he had been asked to surrender company devices. He told me accounts were locked. He told me people wouldn't return his calls. Then he asked me if I was satisfied now. I told him something he hadn't expected. I told him this was never about satisfaction. It was about accuracy. About correcting the record. About refusing to disappear quietly when the truth said otherwise. He looked at me for a long time, then left without another word. The next morning, I received a formal notice from the court. The divorce proceedings would resume, but now, the balance had shifted completely, and he knew it. When the divorce proceedings resumed, the tone had changed entirely. There was no arrogance left in the room, no confident storytelling. What remained were files, timelines, and consequences. The judge made it clear from the start that this phase would focus on division, responsibility, and closure. No performances. No assumptions. My husband's lawyer opened with a request for reconsideration. Not of facts, but of optics. He argued that my public testimony and the forensic report had already damaged his client enough. He suggested a swift settlement to prevent further harm. The judge listened, then asked why fairness had only become important once the truth surfaced. The question didn't need an answer. They proposed terms that would have seemed generous months ago. Shared assets. Quiet separation. Mutual non-disclosure. My lawyer reviewed them carefully, then declined. Not emotionally. Professionally. She pointed out that several assets being offered were already registered under my name. She noted that others were still under investigation. She said we would wait. That was when my husband spoke directly to the judge. He said he had built the company with vision. That without him, nothing would have existed. That technicalities were being used to erase his work. The judge asked him if vision excused misrepresentation. He didn't respond. Outside the courtroom, he tried one last tactic. He appealed to memory. He reminded me of early days, shared struggles, moments that had once mattered. He said we were destroying something that used to be real. I told him the truth again, quietly. I said what we had was real once. What he turned it into wasn't. The following week, the court ordered a formal valuation of all assets. Independent. Neutral. Comprehensive. That included properties, investments, and any interests connected to the company. The numbers began to surface, and with them, the reality he had avoided for years. What he thought he owned wasn't what the law recognized. Meanwhile, inquiries continued outside the courtroom. Former partners came forward. Old emails were reviewed. Decisions once brushed aside were reconsidered. Each layer added weight. Each clarification removed another place for him to hide. One afternoon, my lawyer called me with an update that made me pause. The woman had submitted a statement. Voluntary. She confirmed that he had misled her about his finances and authority. She attached messages, promises, claims he had no right to make. It wasn't revenge on her part. It was self-preservation. That statement would be entered into the record. When my husband learned about it, he didn't react with anger. He didn't react at all. He simply stopped trying. No more messages. No more calls. No more intermediaries. Silence, this time, wasn't strategy. It was defeat. As the next hearing approached, my lawyer told me the judge was preparing a preliminary ruling. Not final, but directional. She said outcomes were becoming clearer. Lines were being drawn. That night, I walked through the house slowly, touching nothing, just observing. I realized something important. For the first time since all this began, I wasn't waiting for the next move. I was ready for the end, and he was running out of time. The preliminary ruling arrived sooner than expected. Not as a final decision, but as a clear direction. The judge outlined what the court recognized as established facts and what still required formal closure. Ownership. Authority. Responsibility. The language was careful, but the meaning was unmistakable. The ground beneath my husband's version of reality was gone. His lawyer requested a private conference with the court. It was granted, briefly. When they returned, the lawyer's tone had shifted again. There was no argument left to make, only mitigation. He spoke about cooperation, about willingness to resolve matters efficiently. He emphasized that his client accepted the court's findings and wished to move forward. The judge acknowledged the statement and said cooperation would be noted. Then he added that accountability would be recorded regardless. That sentence ended the discussion. Outside, my husband finally approached me without anger or strategy. He looked exhausted, like someone who had been carrying a lie too heavy to hold any longer. He said he hadn't imagined it would end this way. He said he thought control meant safety. He said he never believed I would stand where I was standing now. I told him something I had never said before. I told him I hadn't planned revenge. I had planned survival. I told him the difference mattered. He nodded, slowly, as if the idea was settling in for the first time. That afternoon, asset valuations were formally submitted. Numbers replaced assumptions. Properties he claimed were reclassified. Accounts he thought were shared were not. The structure he relied on collapsed under documentation. There was no dramatic moment. Just quiet confirmation. Then came the call I hadn't expected. A representative from the regulatory office informed my lawyer that enforcement action would proceed independently of the divorce. Not immediately, but inevitably. They thanked me for my cooperation. They said my testimony had clarified intent and separation of responsibility. When my lawyer told me, she watched my face carefully. She asked how I felt. I told her the truth. I felt done. The final hearing was scheduled. One last date. One last appearance. One last opportunity for closure. My husband didn't contest it. He didn't delay. He signed where he was told to sign. The man who once controlled every room now followed instructions quietly. On the morning of that hearing, I received a message from him. Just one line, "I see it now." I didn't reply, because seeing it now didn't change what had already been recorded, and for the first time, I understood that endings don't always arrive with noise. Sometimes they arrive with acceptance, and sometimes that is the sharpest twist of all. The final hearing didn't feel final when it began. There were no raised voices, no last-minute surprises. Just a room full of people who already knew how the story ended and were there to make it official. The judge reviewed the record one last time, confirming what had been established over months of scrutiny. Facts had replaced narratives. Documentation had replaced assumptions. The division of assets was read aloud slowly. Properties registered in my name remained mine. Corporate interests tied to verified authority were separated cleanly. Accounts under investigation stayed frozen pending external review. There were no objections. My husband didn't speak. His lawyer didn't interrupt. Silence followed each declaration like a stamp of finality. When the judge asked if either party wished to add anything, my husband stood. For a moment, I thought he might try one last appeal. Instead, he said he accepted the decision. He said he understood now how his actions had consequences beyond what he had imagined. He said nothing more. The judge acknowledged his statement and closed the matter. Just like that, it was over. Outside the courtroom, people moved quickly, already focused on whatever came next for them. My lawyer shook my hand and told me I had done well. Not bravely. Not dramatically. Just well. She said that mattered more than anything else. The company issued another statement that afternoon. Leadership was being restructured permanently. Oversight committees were established. Compliance protocols tightened. My name appeared once formally as part of the transition. No praise. No spotlight. Just accuracy. I went home alone. The house felt different now, not because it was quieter, but because it finally belonged to me in every sense. I packed away old documents, cleared shelves, removed things I had kept out of habit rather than attachment. I wasn't erasing the past. I was organizing it. Later that evening, I received confirmation that the divorce was finalized. No appeals filed. No delays requested. It was done. I read the notice once and closed the file. I didn't feel relief the way people describe it. I felt steady. Then another message arrived. Not from him. From a journalist. They asked for a comment about the case, about the corporate fallout, about the public interest. I declined politely. I had no interest in becoming a symbol. That night, as I turned off the lights, I realized something quietly important. The ending I had prepared for wasn't the one I received. I hadn't just walked away with assets or validation. I had walked away with my name intact, and the story that once erased me could no longer be told without it. After the final hearing, life didn't rush to fill the space that had opened. It settled into it instead. Mornings became quieter, not because there was nothing to do, but because nothing demanded urgency anymore. For years, I had lived inside other people's timelines. Now, time felt like something I could shape. The regulatory process continued without me. Occasionally, my lawyer forwarded updates. Notices issued. Reviews expanded. Enforcement pending. I read them without emotion. That chapter no longer belonged to me. I had given what was required. The rest would unfold on its own. The company moved forward carefully. New leadership took visible steps to distance itself from the past. Internal culture shifted. Decisions were documented twice. Authority was clarified publicly. I wasn't asked to participate beyond formal oversight, and I didn't volunteer. My presence wasn't needed anymore. That felt like progress, not loss. People began reaching out slowly. Some offered apologies for things they had said when they thought I wasn't listening. Others asked how I had stayed so calm. I answered honestly. I said calm was easier when you had already accepted the worst outcome. Silence confused people. They expected anger. They expected celebration. I gave them neither. One afternoon, I ran into the woman by chance. Not planned. Not dramatic. She looked smaller than I remembered, uncertain in a way she hadn't been before. She hesitated, then thanked me. Not for what I had done to him, but for what I hadn't done to her. She said she had learned something about listening to what wasn't being said. I nodded and wished her well. That was all. Later that week, I received a letter forwarded through my lawyer. It was from him. Handwritten. Brief. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He acknowledged the truth of what had happened and said he hoped I would live the life I had postponed for too long. I read it once and filed it away. Some things don't need responses. As days passed, I noticed something unexpected. People began referring to the case without using his name. They called it a governance failure. A cautionary example. My role was mentioned only in footnotes. That was fine. I hadn't done this to be remembered. I had done it to be accurate. One evening, as I sorted through old files, I found my resignation letter from years ago. The one I had written when I believed compromise was permanent. I read it slowly, then tore it in half. Not out of anger. Out of closure, because the truth was I hadn't disappeared back then. I had been waiting, and now the waiting was over. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded quietly, the way truth often does when it no longer needs permission. A regulatory notice became a formal inquiry. An inquiry became proceedings. Proceedings became outcomes. My lawyer summarized it for me in neutral language, but I could hear the finality underneath. His professional life, the one he had built on confidence and shortcuts, was closing its doors one by one. I wasn't called to testify again. My role had been completed, documented, and sealed. That mattered more than anything he could still say. The record didn't need me anymore. It stood on its own. What surprised me most was how people reacted afterward. Some expected me to feel vindicated. Others expected me to feel guilty. A few assumed I must be relieved beyond words. The truth was simpler. I felt clear. When something is finally named correctly, it stops weighing on you. One afternoon, the board requested a brief meeting. Not to ask for guidance or approval, but to inform me of a decision. They were restructuring ownership in a way that aligned with the court's findings. My interests would be formally separated and protected. They thanked me for professionalism during a difficult period. I thanked them in return and declined any public acknowledgement. They respected that. Later that week, I learned that he had tried to negotiate privately with regulators. Not denial. Not defense. Mitigation. It didn't change the outcome. Intent had already been established. Authority had already been misused. There were limits to what explanations could repair. I thought I would feel something when I heard that. Anger. Satisfaction. Regret. Instead, I felt distance. Like watching weather move across a city you no longer live in. Then something unexpected happened. A former employee reached out. Someone junior, someone invisible in meetings, someone whose work had once been dismissed the way mine had been. They told me my testimony had given them the courage to document things they had been afraid to question. They said accuracy mattered now. I sat with that for a long time. That evening, I received one final message from him. Not a request. Not a warning. Just an acknowledgement that the enforcement action was proceeding. He wrote that he understood now what it meant to underestimate silence. He said nothing more. I didn't save the message, because I didn't need proof anymore. The truth had moved beyond our conversation, and for the first time, I realized the twist wasn't what he lost. It was what I gained without ever asking for it. Freedom didn't announce itself the way I had imagined. There was no dramatic morning where everything suddenly felt new. It arrived quietly in small moments I almost missed. Choosing where to go without explaining why. making decisions without anticipating resistance. Sitting in silence that didn't feel heavy anymore, I began revisiting parts of my life I had placed on hold without realizing it. Old interests, half-finished plans, things I had once believed were selfish to want. I didn't rush back into them. I approached them carefully, like you would something fragile that had survived neglect. One afternoon, I attended a small professional gathering at the invitation of someone who remembered my work from years ago. They introduced me not as anyone's former wife, not as part of a scandal, but simply by my name. It startled me how grounding that felt. No qualifiers. No backstory required. During a quiet conversation, someone mentioned the case in passing. Not as gossip, but as an example of how systems sometimes corrected themselves. They didn't know I was part of it. Or maybe they did and chose not to acknowledge it. Either way, I didn't interrupt. I listened as my story was told without me in the room. It was accurate. That was enough. Later, as I walked home, I realized something subtle but important. For years, I had been preparing for confrontation, for defense, for survival. I hadn't prepared for peace. Peace requires a different kind of attention, a different kind of courage. That evening, I received a final update from my lawyer. The enforcement action had concluded. Penalties imposed. Restrictions applied. The language was formal, final, and irreversible. She asked if I wanted copies for my records. I said no. I trusted the system to remember what mattered. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the city settle into night. Somewhere in that city, he was adjusting to a life that no longer responded to his commands. Somewhere else, people were learning to work without fear. And here, in this quiet room, I was learning something new too. I was learning that strength didn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looked like walking forward without turning back. As the night deepened, I picked up a notebook and wrote one sentence at the top of a blank page. Not a plan. Not a goal. Just a truth. I don't need to prove anything anymore. I closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf, knowing I wouldn't need to open it again, because the final twist wasn't in what the world SAW.it was in what I finally allowed myself to stop carrying. The last thing to change was my sense of permission. For years, I had waited for some signal that it was acceptable to move on, to begin again, to take up space without explanation. I didn't realize until much later that permission never comes from the people who benefit from your silence. I started small. A routine that belonged only to me. Mornings shaped by choice, not obligation. Work that felt intentional, not invisible. When people asked about my past, I answered simply. I didn't correct assumptions unless accuracy mattered. I didn't carry the story like a badge or a wound. It was something that had happened, not something that defined me. Occasionally, his name surfaced in conversation. Less frequently each time. The tone shifted too. Where there had once been admiration, there was now caution. Where there had been certainty, there was now reflection. I never added to those conversations. The record already had. One evening, I received a notification confirming the final closure of all related proceedings. No further actions. No pending reviews. Just an official end. I stared at the message longer than necessary, then deleted it. Not out of defiance, but because I didn't need reminders anymore. I thought back to the version of myself who had sat quietly through jokes, dismissals, and assumptions. The woman who had been described as useless in rooms where her work kept everything standing. I wished I could tell her one thing. Not that it would get better. Not that justice would come. Just that silence, when chosen carefully, could be a form of preparation. The truth is, I didn't win by outing anyone. I didn't win by exposing everything all at once. I won by paying attention, by keeping records, by understanding systems better than the people who believed they controlled them, and when the moment came, I didn't raise my voice. I raised the record. Now, when I think about the future, it doesn't feel heavy or urgent. It feels open. Not because everything is possible, but because nothing is forbidden anymore. I am no longer living in response to someone else's version of me. The world moved on, as it always does. New stories replaced old ones. New faces filled the rooms I once left quietly. That was fine. I didn't need the spotlight. I had something better. I had my name, my work, and my truth aligned in the same place at the same time, and for the first time, that alignment felt like freedom. Not loud, not dramatic, just real. The end. I thought the story was over because the paperwork said so. That was my mistake. Endings on paper don't always match endings in real life. Sometimes they only clear the stage for what comes next. A few weeks after everything closed, I received an email that didn't belong to the past or the present. It was from a firm I didn't recognize, written in careful, neutral language. They requested a meeting to discuss an indirect exposure related to the company's former leadership. My name appeared in the subject line, followed by the word confidential. I forwarded it to my lawyer. She called me almost immediately and asked if anything new had happened recently. I told her no. She went quiet, then said this wasn't unusual. When structures collapse, she explained, they often reveal things no one was looking for. She advised me to attend, but not alone. The meeting took place in a glass building I had passed many times without noticing. Inside, everything was minimalist and calm, designed to make difficult conversations feel smaller. The people across the table weren't hostile. They weren't apologetic either. They were precise. They explained that during the forensic process, certain decisions had been traced to entities outside the company. Shells. Partnerships. Quiet channels used to move obligations away from public view. Most of it pointed back to him. But not all of it. One transaction stood out. An old one. Executed years ago. Approved under a framework that existed before controls were formalized. It hadn't violated policy at the time. But now, with everything exposed, it raised questions. Questions about liability. About proximity. About who might still be pulled into the narrative. They weren't accusing me. They were warning me. They said my testimony had drawn a clear line between intent and misuse. But lines can be challenged, especially when others are trying to save themselves. They wanted to know if I had documentation proving distance from that transaction. I did, not because I expected to need it. Because I had always kept everything. When I placed the file on the table, the conversation shifted. The questions changed. The tone softened. They copied what they needed and thanked me for my cooperation. As I stood to leave, one of them said something that stayed with me. He said that systems rarely fail alone. They fail because people assume someone else is watching. Outside, the city felt louder than usual. Not threatening, just alive. I realized then that my calm hadn't come from closure. It had come from readiness. That evening, I checked my phone and saw a missed call from a number I hadn't seen in months. No message, just a silent attempt. I didn't return it, because I finally understood the real twist. The story wasn't about what he lost in the end. It was about how close he came to taking others down with him, and how narrowly that had been avoided. After that meeting, I stopped thinking of the past as something finished. I began seeing it as something contained. There's a difference. Finished things fade. Contained things stay where they belong because you know exactly where the edges are. My lawyer advised me to prepare, just in case. Not for court. Not for testimony. For questions. She said when people realize they can't deny facts, they start asking for context instead. Context is where stories try to slip back in. I understood what she meant. A week later, the questions came. They weren't formal. They arrived as invitations. Coffee. Catch-ups. Quiet dinners. People who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly remembered my number. They asked how I was doing, how I had managed everything so calmly, how I had known what to do. I answered politely, carefully. I spoke about process, not emotion. Documentation, not drama. Every conversation stayed light, but precise. One name kept appearing in these conversations. Not his. Another executive. Someone who had left early, quietly, before the collapse became public. Someone people were now trying to locate. I realized then that others were still rearranging responsibility, trying to make sure it didn't land on them. Then one afternoon, I received a formal request. Not a summons. A request. They wanted a written clarification regarding my involvement in early-stage decisions. Optional, they said. Helpful, they implied. My lawyer smiled when she read it. She said this was how accountability spread when it couldn't be contained anymore. I wrote the clarification myself. Not long. Not defensive. Just factual. Dates. Roles. Boundaries. I attached supporting documents and sent it back. When you're accurate, you don't need to be loud. Days passed. Then silence, until one evening when my phone rang from a blocked number. I didn't answer. A message followed, written quickly, without care. It was him. He said people were calling him. He said names were being dragged back into things that were over. He said I needed to fix this. I stared at the screen, not with anger, but with something close to disbelief. Even now, he believed problems were solved by control. That someone else should step in and clean up what he left behind. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the message to my lawyer and turned my phone off. The next morning, news broke quietly. A secondary investigation. Limited scope. Specific individuals. Not my name. Not anymore. The line had held. I sat at my desk, sunlight cutting across the room, and felt something I hadn't felt before, relief without fear, because for the first time, I wasn't waiting to see if the truth would protect me. I already knew it would. The investigation moved forward without me, the way it should have from the beginning. Names surfaced. Timelines were revisited. People who had once been confident in silence began speaking carefully, measuring every word. When accountability finally spreads, it doesn't roar. It whispers, and everyone listens. I received confirmation through my lawyer that I was no longer considered connected to any unresolved exposure. The wording was precise, deliberate, and final. It didn't congratulate me. It didn't reassure me. It simply stated the facts. That was enough. With that closure, something else shifted. I stopped anticipating interruptions. I stopped checking my phone before sleeping. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. The quiet in my life stopped feeling temporary. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a small, closed-door forum. No press. No audience beyond a handful of professionals. They didn't ask me to tell my story. They asked me to explain my process. How I kept records. How I separated trust from verification. How I noticed patterns before they became problems. I agreed on one condition. No names. No case references. Just principles. The discussion was calm, thoughtful, and unexpectedly grounding. When it ended, several people thanked me. Not for bravery. For clarity. That word followed me home. Later that evening, I received another letter from him. Shorter than the last. Less controlled. He said he was being asked to account for things he didn't remember approving. He said people were using my accuracy against him. He said it wasn't fair. I folded the letter and placed it in a folder I had labeled closed. Not out of spite. Out of discipline. Some conversations lose their relevance the moment they repeat themselves. Days later, a final update arrived. The secondary investigation had concluded. Findings issued. Consequences applied. The process had ended as cleanly as it could. My lawyer told me there would be no further contact. No follow-ups. No surprises. That night, I sat with a cup of tea and thought about how close everything had come to being different. How easily confusion could have swallowed truth if I hadn't paid attention years earlier. If I hadn't trusted process over panic, the twist wasn't that I had been underestimated. It was that I had underestimated how much quiet preparation mattered, and how powerful it becomes when tested. With everything finally settled, the world seemed to recalibrate around me. Not in big ways, but in subtle ones. Conversations no longer circled back to the past. Invitations weren't framed by curiosity or caution. People met me where I was, not where they thought I had been. I made one decision I hadn't planned for. I stepped away from anything connected to the company entirely. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I transferred my remaining interests cleanly, deliberately, without negotiation. It surprised a few people. They expected me to hold on, to protect, to monitor. But I had done enough of that for a lifetime. When I signed the final document, I felt lighter than I had at any point during the ordeal. Ownership, I realized, isn't just about possession. It's about choice. And this was mine. A few weeks later, I moved. Not far. Just enough to feel the difference. A smaller space. Brighter light. Windows that opened without effort. I didn't take much with me. Only what I used, what I loved, what made sense. Occasionally, news would drift in through second-hand conversations. He had accepted a reduced role elsewhere. Temporary. Advisory. Carefully supervised. The kind of position designed to look forward while never fully forgetting the past. I felt no reaction to it. That surprised me more than anything. One evening, as I unpacked the last box, I found the notebook where I had once written a single sentence about proving nothing. I read it again and smiled. Proof, I had learned, wasn't something you chased. It was something you allowed to surface. A message arrived from my lawyer. Not a warning. Not an update. Just a short note saying it had been a privilege to work with someone so prepared. I thanked her and closed the thread. That relationship, too, was complete. As night settled in, I stood by the window of my new place and watched lights flicker on across the city. Somewhere, new stories were beginning. Somewhere else, old ones were finally being told accurately. And here, in this quiet room, I felt something settle into place. I wasn't rebuilding. I was continuing, and the most surprising part was how little noise it required. The last realization came to me on an ordinary morning. No message, no document, no reminder from the past. Just sunlight through the window and the sound of the city starting its day. That was when I understood something simple and permanent. Nothing was chasing me anymore. For a long time, I had lived as if I needed to stay alert, ready to defend, ready to explain, ready to prove. Even after everything ended, that habit lingered. It took time to unlearn it. Time to trust that silence no longer meant danger. That quiet no longer meant erasure. I built my days slowly, intentionally. Work that respected boundaries. People who asked questions and waited for answers. Decisions made without fear of backlash. I didn't talk about resilience or strength. I practiced it privately, the way it mattered most. Occasionally, someone would discover who I was connected to, what I had been part of, what had happened. They would look at me differently for a moment, searching for drama. I never gave it to them. The story didn't belong to curiosity anymore. It belonged to record, to process, to truth already settled. One afternoon, I walked past a building where I had once sat quietly while others spoke over me. The memory surfaced briefly, then passed. It had no power left. That surprised me. Not because I had forgiven anything, but because I no longer needed to remember it to understand myself. The final twist wasn't revenge. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even justice in the way stories usually describe it. It was independence, not the loud kind. Not the performative kind. The kind that lets you sleep without rehearsing conversations. The kind that lets your name exist without explanation. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. I had been called useless once, in a room full of people who believed it. That word no longer had meaning to me. It belonged to a version of the world that hadn't been paying attention. I had paid attention. I had kept records when others kept stories. I had stayed quiet when others performed. And when the moment arrived, I didn't need to raise my voice. I let the truth speak. Now, when I think about the future, it doesn't feel uncertain. It feels open. Not because everything is guaranteed, but because nothing is controlled by fear anymore. The story ends here, not with applause, not with punishment, not with regret, just with a woman standing fully inside her own life, unhidden, unafraid, and finally unquestioned.